Welcome to the Anthropology in Business podcast, where you'll learn about the many ways anthropology is applied in business and why business anthropology is one of the most effective lenses for making sense of organizations and consumers. Through conversations with leading anthropologists working in advertising, marketing, consumer behavior, organizational culture, user experience, and many other roles, you'll learn firsthand what it means to do business anthropology and how the work differs from academic anthropology. We will discuss issues like the pace and depth of research in business, our visibility and influence as practitioners, and what we can do to build our brand. We will also focus on the value and impact of our research in business so that we can help business leaders understand why they should be hiring anthropologists. I'm your host, Matt Artz, a business anthropologist specializing in design anthropology and working at the intersection of product management, user experience, and business strategy. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Matt Artz of Anthropology and Business podcast. Today, I'm with Adam Gamwell, who many of you will know from This Anthro Life podcast. Adam has a PhD in cultural anthropology from Brandeis. Today, is senior researcher at MotivBase. And previously co-founder of Missing Link and, of course, the host of TAL. So, Adam, thanks for coming on. Appreciate it. Would you mind by telling everybody how you got interested in anthropology?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be here. It's always fun to talk with you. And I love all the work you're doing, man. You're putting out so many forms of content and helping get Anthro into the stratosphere. So, a salute to a fellow media magnate here. But yeah, so anthro, on one level, anthropology's kind of been in my DNA from one being a child and loving Indiana Jones, which is probably an answer that most of us will say on some level, or maybe be willing to admit. It was one of the classes I took in college. Like first semester, I had to pick an elective. So it's probably a common story. And I loved cultural anthropology. The class, it was super interesting, and so that just kind of kicked off my interest. And then that just grew over time, and ended up looking into graduate school, and moved from Texas, where I'm from, to Boston to go to Brandeis for a master's, and ended up also doing PhD there. And what really kind of sparked my continued interest was again getting these questions of both what it means to be human in this broad sense, but then as I moved through both masters and then into PhD, I became increasingly interested in what we now call like applied anthropology. And then from there, we'll see that things kind of moved and shifted further into design anthropology, and then now into business anthropology. And so I see all these pieces kind of working together in different frameworks. But what this was kind of got me thinking about was, how do we do work as anthropologists and bring an anthropological mindset to helping people solve problems. And so as part of my PhD research, I was working with an NGO in southern Peru in designing conservation programs for quinoa farmers. And so it was a mix of both doing kind of what we call interventionist work. This is kind of where I found design anthropology, and doing work in terms of how do we design conservation incentives and mechanisms and programs for farmers, but then at the same time, how do we provide space for the multiple forms of knowledge and knowledge building in terms of indigenous forms of agriculture and cosmology, as well as scientific forms. And also, one of the cool things that I found there too is realizing how much overlap there actually is between what we talk about. We may draw lines between indigenous and scientific forms of knowledge, but how they can come together in really unique ways, especially in the same person. It's something that struck me that we don't often think or hear about a term that's like the indigenous scientist. And that struck me as something weird, right? Because these are the kinds of people that we would see. They're also the ones making business decisions. They're also the ones making production decisions for quinoa and where to sell it and how to come up with business ideas. So business started filtering into my thinking process in fieldwork. And I got really excited about how do we think about markets and international movements of goods and things like that. And so then as I kind of moved from school and moving towards coming out of PhD, I have done a number of years of teaching, adjunct professor in different areas. But one of the things I found was that I always would do my best kind of teaching, or I felt most alive when I was in not straight up anthropology departments, for lack of a better term. So teaching in a design program or an engineering school, for example, or a business program. And this, I kind of stumbled into these other ways or other areas of where an anthropologist could teach, a bit by accident, but a bit by just from the design angle, spending time hanging out with like UX and design collectives and like meetup groups, for example, in Boston, as I was interested in what that scene was like as I was kind of finishing school, figuring out what might I do for my work and my career moving forward, because I didn't want to go into academia. And so design gave me one kind of area, and then, but I, did it slowly. Instead of like jumping over to a UX or a design job, I ended up teaching in a design program, as an anthropologist. And so I got kind of a soft launch, I guess, as it were, into the business world. In that regard. But then it also kind of cemented that I love teaching, and education is always part of how I think about my work. And I'll talk about that and how that relates to MotivBase that I do today. But at the same time, thinking about, there's a lot of interesting ways that we can approach and solve problems, thinking in these hybrid areas in terms of like anthropology may not be the most, or might not be the foremost thing that comes to somebody's mind, for example. So a bit of kind of back and forth there in terms of what that has meant for me in terms of through school into the business part. And then, the parallel track with that is during PhD, as folks may know too, that I started doing This Anthro Life, like my second year of PhD.
Now 8 years old as of yesterday. I was 11 years old.
Yeah.
So congrats.
Yes. We just turned 8. That's right. Yeah. Which is crazy to think about too, that's a long time to make a podcast. It's like I should have my, my third album out by this point, but I don't quite, but that other side of it too was the kind of the other part where I was, anthropology, I think, collects and tells some of the most interesting stories in the world. We study with all kinds of people in all kinds of places and look at some of the craziest things on the planet. From quinoa conservation to Wall Street, and just see like what's happening in so many areas. And so many of those stories have trouble getting out into to wider publics, which is a term I just critiqued in my last episode, in terms of the vague idea of where else are these episodes going. And so, I really was trying to, think through how do we do that. And so for me, podcasting or having conversations was one way that we might play with, how anthropology gets shared. And, one of those, like the rest is history kind of thing we can break down if we want at any point. But just like I fell in love with the medium and doing that kind of work. And that fundamentally shifted also how I think about anthropology. And that, on one level, I'd say I'm a crappy scholar because I got a degree, but I'm not like a hardcore researcher in an academic sense. And, podcasting to me gave me this way of being able to do research and to think about how do we disseminate knowledge in new ways and also bring new people into the conversation, literally. But, have some of the trappings of the deep research of academic anthropology, but have the accessibility of something you might find in NPR. And so I still haven't totally cracked that nut, but that's kind of the goal, is to put those two elements together. And, so part of it is how do we think about communicating and telling the stories that anthropology puts out in the world? And then the other side is, this track of going from academic anthropology and education into teaching, into design, and then finally actually into business itself. So that's a lot to start with, but those are kind of the two parallel tracks.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So let's go kind of way back to the beginning. Obviously we know each other a bit, and so I've heard some of these things, but probably not everything still. And I guess one of the questions I have, you talk about the work in Peru as being interventionist, but I guess there's the question of, did you go down there with that intention, or did you sort of discover the need to be interventionist while there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I was proposing the research, so with my dissertation committee and department and figuring out what I was going to do for research, the way I proposed it at the time is as kind of applied research. And so I found the NGO that I worked with for my dissertation research by accident, as I was doing research in terms of what quinoa markets in terms of how are people thinking about quinoa and biodiversity. And so I found this NGO by accident, and I was like, wow, this is great. They're working on this project. So then I reached out to them and just said, hey, I'm an anthropologist. I'm going to go do research. I'd love to talk with you. And then they just said, hey, actually, man, we need some help doing some programs. Would you like to help us run them? And I was like, yeah. And so to them, free labor. To me, I got a dissertation partner, so there's a mutual benefit there. Mm-hmm. And so that, basically kind of pushed into my head more concretely that an applied approach is something that I'm interested in doing with work. I was leaning towards this idea. I didn't want to just do a pure academic research project because I was uncomfortable with the idea of going there, doing research, extracting and leaving. And so applied felt right or felt better. And so finding an NGO gave me a partner to work with. And so what's interesting is that, so I went to the field thinking about doing applied anthropology, meaning how do I help a community solve a problem, kind of on their terms. And as I started working with the NGO, it then became apparent I was doing interventionist work. I was going there to actually change these people's lives by designing programs to help them actually make market decisions that would actually affect the way and change how they're doing agriculture. And making decisions. And so the thing is, I actually wrestled with that for a little while because I didn't yet have the vocabulary. So interventionist is what I say now. But so in Peru, I was living in Lima at the time, in the city to start. And while I was in this time getting to know the NGO, and I was working also with the Peruvian Ministry of the Environment, who was partnered with this NGO. So I was working at very high level organizations. Cultural anthropology graduate programs really hammer into you need to work with the people, air quotes, right? And it didn't feel like the government was the people, right? And so there's something about, well, where's the farmers, and I was struggling with this idea of what does it mean to work at these levels? And I don't even get to the farmers yet. And so part of this was I'm looking at these and working with these organizations of designing intervention ideas abstractly. And then we're going to go to Puno, which is in South Peru, to then start talking with farmers and think about how do we put the programs together. And so in this time of being in Lima and working with these higher level organizations, I was just digging around like one does, on, Anthro Journal websites, and I don't even remember where. And then I found design anthropology. I'd not heard of it until I went to the field. And then I saw Ton Otto and Rachel Smith and these scholars that had written design anthropology theory and practice, Wendy Gunn's book, and a bunch of other of those readers. Design Anthropological Futures, I think was either coming out or just come out. And then I was like, oh man, this is describing what I'm trying to figure out, interventionist work. It's going in there and designing with and for people that feels better than just going there and saying, hey, the government has an idea for a program, so it gave me a bit of a moral compass in terms of how do we think about anthropology in an active sense. And I liked, and I guess I aligned with this idea of design anthropology and interventionist work a little bit more than applied. I don't need to draw a super strict definition or line there, but it seemed like the point of design anthropology was to design with, for, and alongside others, and that resonated and felt right to me. And also, I guess a bit in a theoretical perspective, it was a bit more fresh to build on because I have to write a dissertation too. So that gave me a little bit more fodder to think with, I guess. And so, I guess that's part of it. So no, I didn't go into the field thinking about the interventionist work, and it kind of happened. And then I actually found the vocabulary because it was kind of already happening, if that makes sense, which is a weird thing.
It is interesting though that, and I guess it's somewhat of a testament to Brandeis that they even really supported an applied, proposal. I talk to now, many people who, when they speak about their programs, maybe online, maybe offline, but nonetheless, when speaking about them, that they're often, the exact opposite of that, when it's a more traditional program. And so that's pretty cool. And I also did see that Brandeis recently, there was just that post yesterday that they're trying to do a little bit more, have a little bit more focus on preparing for jobs. So, that seems like, a feather in their cap, but nonetheless, so you go down there, you have this applied project in mind, it sort of takes on a little bit new form, becomes a little bit more interventionist as you learn of the design anthropology literature. And, that is somewhat around how we meet, really, to sort of tie a few things together. You were doing an episode or a few episodes where design anthropology was being dropped on TL. And so we connected kind of around that. And really that's kind of the shared interest that somewhat brought us together. But at that time, we were also talking about public anthropology, which of course shows its face in TAL and other such things that you've done since. And you pointed out at the start of the podcast about the episodes that I'm creating, but of course, my podcast, Gabby's podcast, many of us obviously took influence from TAL and are, of course, likewise appreciative of that. I mean, you really kind of started it in the anthropology space. And so what made you get interested in, I know you said, the sort of perspective of education, but what really got you interested in more so in like the public anthropology perspective?
Like that's a good question. Like, why would we care about wider publics knowing about anthropology, or like a public approach? So public anthropology as a framework or something that stood out, like came earlier, so like, cause TAL, I started, again, really early on in PhD. And so, I think it was just, even as we got started, there was just something about the idea of like the urban legend story is that, me and Ryan Collins, my colleague, we would be at the bar after class, like one does, and discussing, something about Marxian theory that we're like, labor theory of value is really interesting for X, Y, and Z reasons. And every once in a while, we'd say something that was like, man, that's actually pretty good. We should write that down. And then we got lazy and thought about what if we recorded it. And so part of it was just thinking about this idea of there's these great insights that if you and your friend can discuss them, and obviously we're classmates, so it was very still like academic-y sounding. What would it look like if we tried to like expand that further? So we talked to a third colleague, Anil Tripathi, and he had access to the Brandeis radio station. And so we just like, okay, well, let's get together and talk once a week and see what we can do. And so part of it was this idea that I hadn't realized it was actually so easy to, one, just start talking. And for me, again, the conversation was kind of the way that I was drawn to this idea of like, how can we talk about these ideas in a more accessible way? And because I, believed that we were learning so many interesting and fun things every week in classes, and just this such like, I don't know, mind-blowing theoretical idea, or just a really cool example from Papua New Guinea of how we think about time differently, that just would like totally fundamentally shift our 9-to-5 thinking in the US or something, And so there's so much kind of coming at me so quickly that part of it was like, I was like a 5-year-old that wanted to share it with everybody, and then I was frustrated that we couldn't. And then I was like, where are these conversations? Where else is this happening in ways that people can find it? And there wasn't. The other part of it too is I'm actually a very slow reader, which is annoying to me, but it's worse in graduate school because you have to read 300 pages a week. And that's like, it added stress on top of a stressful experience. And so one of my outlets was to be able to talk through the things I was digesting. Mm-hmm. And I realized like this little alchemy of these things started working for me, where it's like, okay, this is actually a great way to get out some of the ideas that I think that would actually help us think better, us in a broad sense. And then also I can process some of the things that I'm learning and then do it in a way that's fun with my colleagues. And so, and a radio show just seemed cool, and so like part of it was these elements. And so then I realized too that the idea of, in finding a commitment towards making these ideas more accessible really resonated, and it kind of sat with me. I said, this feels right. This feels better than, again, just taking the knowledge internally and turning it around back for ourselves, again, being academic anthropologists as the audience. And so, because this is me looking back on this now, but like the way I think about this too is like, again, it became this question of audience also. And so me, public anthropology, I was interested in the audience of the public, in essence, in terms of who else needs to hear these stories. Anthropologists can already hear them. And I don't think we tell them very well, in academic literature and journals and ethnographies, because it's complex, difficult language. And so, it became this question of what does it mean to think about these being more accessible forms of knowledge and conversation, and then having a conversation with someone. And so it slowly started, building, and then looking at what else has been done around public anthropology and what has what kind of quote unquote popular forms of anthropology were out there. And at the time, Savage Minds was probably the biggest blog, now called Anthrodendum. And Jason Antrosio had his Living Anthropologically blog also. And I think it started like a year before we started doing TAL. And so that was basically like also a kind of repository. And Jason's really big on showing his syllabi and classes and collecting materials from the community in terms of how to make learning and teaching more accessible. And Savage Minds, Anthrodendum is always been kind of a guest post blog in terms of people coming in there and sharing information and stories and kind of writing back and forth. But neither of them were a super conversational or fundamentally, in my opinion, pointed towards just a generalized group of people. Like, I wouldn't necessarily see them on NPR or in Redbook, for example. And so that's not to dig on them at all, because I understand like the step that they're taking, and they've done like incredible work in terms of setting that precedent. And just for me, like the format of conversation it's just a bit of how I think. I guess I talk to things sometimes, and it resonated. And so I don't know, it's a part of it. Like it's a bit of a gravity thing. It's like it kind of starts and keeps going, and there's something about like making myself have a weekly episode set and having to think through a topic. And I really enjoyed the quickness of the research and the ability, how do we turn it around into something that we can talk about? And it was fresh in a way that didn't require, 6 hours of digging around per book and footnotes and citations and MLA and whatever, format. And so the criteria was different, I think. And so a lot of that got me thinking about, what does it mean to make this information publicly accessible? And I don't know, and that just stuck. I mean, that's what anthropology needs to do, I think, and I still believe that, here we are.
Yeah,
but,
sure.
So I don't know. It's interesting because it's the idea. One thing that really that jumped out to me across the years is I've talked to a bunch of the, writers from Savage Minds and folks that have done public, facing kind of anthropology things, folks that have written about public anthropology. And I was always kind of struck, this may have been like youthful hubris, but like I was always kind of struck that they oftentimes I'd get a bit of dismissiveness from them in terms of like, well, I've already written about that, or I've been doing stuff about that for 10 years and nobody listens anyway. And so, and I respect that. I respect that. Like that's the perspective that they've had, and think about, what does that mean? What would it feel like to say, I'm trying to do public anthropology, but nobody's listening? And so I took that to heart, and not because, again, I think that they were wrong or they did the wrong approach, but it does tell me that there's something about the medium and how we're communicating to others that public anthropology doesn't matter if you don't actually think about who the public is. And so what I alluded to a little bit ago in terms of the episode I just released as of this recording was just reflecting on This Anthro Life's 8th birthday. And, the public anthropology angle that has always that I've come to understand more of is that, and I think this is why we're seeing such a challenge with having anthropology be out in part of broader audiences. And I'll include business in this too, which we can jump to in a minute. I know I'm talking a lot. Is this idea that like we have to actually define our audiences. Like we can't just say, I want to do public anthropology, because that doesn't mean anything. I mean, National Public Radio sounds like the same thing, but they know who their audience is. They do audience research. And this is something I didn't know as an anthropologist. And, I've later now come to understand, and I have done this for This Anthro Life and for other projects. And there's a concreteness that comes to understanding who you're designing your work for, and how you're helping them solve problems. And so, anyway, I don't know. So there's something about that, like it's kind of an always shifting target, but the shifting has become way more specific. Like now it's I know who I'm targeting, and I know their name and what they're looking for, if that makes sense. And so there's something about that. And even actually, I mean, you helped us with TAL back in the day start thinking about this. You kind of brought some UX thinking. I think you helped us do our first audience survey, actually. So it took me a long time to digest and understand that. So I'm just a slow learner, I guess.
Well, we all are in our own ways. Obviously, in the podcasting space, I was quite late to the game, but it is an impactful medium, which is why I've jumped in, and it is helping to get the word out in a way that it seemed as if text wasn't doing, and it sounds like the people you've talked to maybe are supporting that, begrudgingly maybe. But before we move on to business, what I'd be curious to know, obviously you were adjuncting, we were at conferences, so we're interacting still with academia, right? We have kind of we have like a one toe still in there to some degree, right? And have you been having any conversations about how academia is starting to perceive podcasting? Because I have not, so I don't know what that is, how they feel about it. But it seems as if there are people out there who are waking up to the idea that, there needs to be some new mediums and some new ways of doing things. I mean, it's slow. This is not a tidal wave coming across academia by any means, but it does seem that there are certainly more podcasts than when you started by, even just in the anthropology space, there are many more. And it seems like, other people are starting to appreciate, South by Southwest, which you're going to be at, and we'll talk about, TED, all these sort of other opportunities, all these other venues. So have you heard anything? And let me just also say that the reason I'm asking is it's like, I guess there's a question like, should this even be considered as something valuable on a CV, which I think it should, right? But, is it equivalent to a journal article at some point in the future, or maybe not equivalent, but somehow, valued?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that? Anything you've heard?
Yeah, that's a good set of questions. And I like this line of thinking. So the short answer is I'm also an N sample size of 1, but like I don't know of many academic programs that are changing their tune in terms of what counts for tenure. I know that the conversations are happening, and how podcasting fits into that, I'm not super privy to it. But I mean, a couple of things I can say that I think that give me hope is that one, I agree with you that like we need to change like the metrics by which we measure and value accomplished academic work, and so podcasting, for example, being a medium. I mean,
if I could just jump in, right? I mean, like things like citations versus listeners. Okay. So you have X amount of like double-digit citations or even hundreds. Well, if you have 30,000 listeners, I mean, you know what I mean?
I know. Wow. Yeah. Right. This is exactly right. I mean, it's like, okay, if you've had 400,000 people listen to your show, and like, does that not count for something,
Right.
I mean, I think it's like, I remember too, like years ago that we, my original co-host, Ryan and Neil and I, we were kicking around the idea of like, what would it take to have like a peer-reviewed podcast, and I don't see why you couldn't do that. I mean, it's just like, why not talk it through your sources, and like, if you have people that say, okay, let me look at it and make sure that we're fact checking it, and then you have to change it otherwise. So I think you like fundamentally could. I think one of the challenges with doing that is that it would need to be a more produced show, which is not, a challenge, but just like you have to have segments and parts and like be able to swap things out. It couldn't just be a straight conversation unless you're just like a super badass that can just like say everything and all the citations, and so I think part of it would be that. And I think that, as you know, too, that the barrier to entry to making this media isn't super high, but even just making a conversational show that we're doing right here still takes a ton of time afterwards, like for production and pre-planning and scheduling. All this stuff takes a ton of time. So it's like, it's one of those, people get excited about it and then say, oh wait, this is actually a huge amount of work to make one episode, let alone a series. So hats off to anybody that makes these, because they are a lot harder. And so part of it that's made me feel good is academics, when they realize actually this is not, just, podcast, done. Right. When they realize it actually is a production set of work, because that then shows, and like, to me, then I'm finding when they do that, then they are saying, okay, now I see, I'm already starting to value the labor differently, right? That goes into making this. It isn't just some like, well, there's just two people talking. Like, it's not that, I mean, it is that, but it's not just that. And so part of it is, I think, clarifying what labor it is to make this kind of production too. And like, not to just prize writing as something that's the only way. Other things I've seen, like, and this is also Brandeis's case and also working with me. So, we can take that for what it is. But, what's been really, really cool since I finished in PhD in 2018, since then, I have done multiple things with Brandeis. I mean, other schools too, but Brandeis has some of the best examples in terms of that. I have, in the fall of 2020, I ran a internship program with Brandeis on podcasting. And so I had 5 interns from across the graduate school. So folks that were in humanities and social sciences. We did internships on like media production and we worked on This Anthro Life and my colleague Elizabeth Ferry's podcast for Call This Book. And so we kind of split the interns. I did training sessions with everybody every few weeks and, did podcast marketing, did podcast development, did how to tell stories. And so that was actually really cool. And this was like, they got class credit for it. And I got to have interns for a semester. So super cool trade-off. And so so also saying this, like, so if universities or schools are listening, this kind of work exists. It just takes Matt or myself or someone talk to one of us, and this is the kind of stuff we can do with you. And it's a great way to both help show the kind of work that is necessary and possible to do this. And then also you're doing it in for lack of a better term, a supervised academic context. And so you have some control over what's being made and how it's being made. And so if the kind of content makes a difference, then that's one way that you could push towards it. So I hope to see more. I know like SFAA has their podcast project, for example, Society for Applied Anthropology. But it's like interesting because even EPIC, the Ethnographic Practice and Industry, or AAA, American Anthropological Association, they have their podcast network. EPIC does video series, but it's like we don't see that many podcasts from universities or podcasts from these organizations themselves. That's something that I lightly pursued for a few years with all these different organizations. And it's they for one reason or never really took, and that's fine. But it is a question too of like, why are we always, the podcasters all tend to be independent. And so that's just a question we should ask ourselves too, in terms of where might support come from? What might it look like? What does it mean to show universities what the value of doing this kind of work is, both for a CV, but then also, if you want to get your name out there as a scholar, or the university wants to get their name out there, what could it look like, And so, the only other example I can think of right now is like Harvard Business School and their HBR podcast they started doing, So it's like business schools are doing it more. So the question is, why aren't social sciences?
Yeah, well, business schools do a lot of things that anthropologists, or at least practicing
yes,
anthropologists might be doing. But so to your last point, though, it's a good jumping off point, because you, in many ways, were using it to generate business, both as a founder of Missing Link Studios, co-founder, I should say, right, with Astrid, I think, and so using it for your own entrepreneurship, but also eventually it really did turn into, my understanding, right, is your now full-time gig. And that's pretty amazing, right? I mean, you're basically using this medium to essentially to kind of conduct business, maybe not conduct, but to, for business development purposes in some sense. And, through Missing Link and kind of storytelling, really selling a lot of the same kind of services, if you will, right? You're sort of like taking it and packaging what you've learned from podcasting and selling it. So it has had a real practical application in your life, and now a really long lasting sort of impact, charting you kind of on this new path that you're in with MotivBase. So, it's not just some sort of emerging medium that it has no value. I mean, this has really shaped your life, and it's it's also an opportunity to network and meet people. That's one of the most interesting things I found about it through COVID. And, I started mine during COVID for that being one of the reasons. I mean, it of course gives back. I'm very career oriented, right? So it kind of gives back in that sense, but it's also an opportunity to like meet and see people when we weren't going to see them otherwise. Which, if you recall, is almost one of the reasons I reached out to you. Being in an online program, I was never seeing students. So
totally, yeah.
It was just an opportunity to kind of connect with people. And so that thread keeps coming back for me, and it's now happened for you. And so it has, podcasting has had a lot of value. And so you may want to maybe just talk about, briefly kind of what you did, with Missing Link, and then we'll kind of get into, MotivBase.
Yeah, sure.
It's a hard word to say. MotivBase.
MotivBase. It is. I know maybe I'm used to saying it now, I think, but yes, it does. It's actually like my name is hard to say, Adam Gamwell, because there's two M's right next to each other. So it's like MotivBase is also kind of like, you want to just mumble it out a little bit. So yeah, so Missing Link Studios, I co-founded that with my colleague Astrid County. And the reason that we started putting that together was like after school ended for me, and I was doing some adjuncting, but I wanted to move more into the business world. And so her and I put our heads together in terms of how do we find clients? What can we offer? We're both anthropologists. She's a tech anthropologist. I was a design anthropologist. What can we kind of put together? And so one of the areas that we found was interesting that was kind of in between that, and also with podcasting, was this idea of storytelling, as an SA, storytelling as a service, right? But just this idea in terms of like, how can we help organizations or individuals, both define and articulate their stories and what matters to them, what their values are and what they want to put out in the world. And it's funny, that was the goal. We ended up actually just doing a lot of web design and design stuff because that was a quicker way and easier way to find client work. But then, that helped me think through what would people think is a worthy story to tell. And, so part of it was this kind of work in terms of going through and doing client work. And then eventually it began to morph into what we might call more, quote, traditional research, where I would go do a client engagement and do like a series of interviews and then come back to some analysis on what we're finding. And then, either write up a report on CEO perceptions of change during COVID, or on helping a mental health organization redesign their in-person curriculum to work online because of COVID. And so different kind of projects like that I very much enjoyed, in this kind of work. And then, like yourself noted too, in terms of like kicking off podcasting during COVID, I was actually on a client engagement in Canada as COVID began to become a thing in the Western world. And we were halfway done with it. And they called us up and they're like, you have to go home now. We're closing the country. I was like, oh, okay. So like change plans, go back to Toronto, fly back to Boston. That's it, And so we ended up finishing the project remotely online. But like yourself too, I was grounded in a way that I hadn't been before. And that made it difficult to figure out what would happen next, So like yourself, having podcasting as a medium that I was doing in person, but now obviously needs to be much more remote, continued to matter. And so that became a more important kind of lifeline almost for business, for networking, for some of the similar reasons. And part of it was that, doing research for folks to interview for the show and seeing what else is out there. I came across MotivBase on LinkedIn and saw that they had an AI anthropologist. And I was just like, what the hell is that? That sounds cool. And so read about the company, said, this sounds amazing. This is such an interesting idea of using software and big data and quant and qual together in this really unique way. And so then I reached out to the CEO to invite him to be on the podcast. And then to my surprise, he came back and said, dude, I love your show. I've been listening to it for years. And I was like, oh, cool.
That's great.
And so then we got to talking, and did a pre-interview. And then he was just like, really what we need is, a lot of this work is like, we need researchers that are willing to have like an academic mindset, but are willing to kind of do work in industry, and help with market research and but bring the anthropological and knowledge of culture. We need that, but we also need is people that know how to communicate that. That's actually one of the hardest things, to find social scientists that can actually like translate and like broker the insights that we find. And so he goes, I mean, you can do this with this cast. I mean, would you be interested? And I was like, yes. The timing was good. It's like I had COVID was there. I had work dried up because of COVID. And so, the challenge sounded interesting. And so, so I've been there now for, a bit over a year and a half. And it's been super interesting, super fun. And I've kind of moved. I began as a researcher at MotivBase. And then now I'm, a very cool sounding job title, the senior anthropologist. And I work primarily on basically the client success side of stuff, where we brief in projects, deliver them with clients, and then kind of go through, and I do a lot of working sessions. So I can talk about that stuff if you'd like to, but it has been an interesting journey. So, I mean, podcasting literally got me a job. So kids, remember, podcasting is cool. And it has value, and like that counts for the CV in this case, but yeah, so it's been kind of a mix of that in terms of, from storytelling as a service, for lack of a better term, into research, and then into continuing to use podcasting as a tool for networking, communicating, and then finding my way into the work I do now.
Yeah, that's great. And so to focus on what you're doing now, AI anthropology sounds super cool, right? But AI kind of gets tossed around very loosely. So can you talk about like what you guys are actually doing? Like, how are you really combining those?
Yeah, sure. No, it's a good question, right? And so basically what we do is we collect conversational data month over month. And so in this case, anywhere that consumers are having long form conversations, we kind of have two major criteria for collecting data. And one is anywhere that they're having long form conversation, which could be like Reddit or Quora, or if we're sharing a news article and commenting on it, for example, or YouTube comments. The flip side is we don't do social media listening. So this is not a social media listening platform. So we don't use Facebook or Twitter or data sources like that. And the second criteria is that if we have any pseudonymity or anonymity from users, so that we don't have their real names. This is important both for GDPR compliance, but then on top of that, it's important for if you have ever been on social media or just seen someone on Reddit, you can tell who's being a bit more honest. And it's often when your name is not attached or your picture is attached to what you're saying. And that makes a difference. So basically what we do with MotivBase is that we do observational ethnography using conversational data online. And the kind of platform that we've built is what we call contextual intelligence. And so if you and I are having a conversation about gut health, let's say, and I'm like, oh, gut health is important. And you're like, yeah, probiotics are a neat idea. And then I say, yeah, but I'm not really sure about lactobacillus. And then we're kind of going back and forth. And you and I know we're talking about gut health. Traditional Boolean keyword search engines can't see that. These are connected ideas. They just know, like, if you typed gut health, it'll show you the website where this conversation took place, but it has no idea that this is actually part of that we're talking in context. Mm-hmm. And so kind of the platform is able to then look at the wider context of a conversation and understand what we're talking about as people. And so if you do that and you aggregate that over big data sets of scraping millions of data points every month, and then look at that over time, you're able to get a sense in terms of size of how many people are talking about a certain topic, get ideas in terms of what are the associations in the context around which topics people are talking about. And so you kind of get a bit of an inside window from a big data scale in terms of, what are the associations that consumers have about whatever topic they're talking about? What's it look like? And then, so that's kind of the big data collection part. And then we as anthropologists do the interpretive, qualitative research on top of that in terms of understanding and interpreting what it is that we're seeing. The system is very good at pulling things together, but it's still, AI, to your point, it can do a lot of things in terms of reacting or triggering something. It'll then collect data, but it doesn't interpret anything. AI is nowhere near that. And so basically, so it still takes humans to kind of think through what's happening in that data and kind of think about that. And so, so we do basically client-based work. We work with a lot of Fortune 500 companies in terms of doing market research. What's happening in the culture of gut health, for example, or where is where's fandom going, and so basically anything that they want to look at. And so, by blending these two different elements together, we can do kind of 5-day research sprints that get a pretty solid amount of ethnographic detail, by combining the big data sets and some of our interpretive tools in essence. So it's a super interesting process.
Yeah, sure. And is it mostly like natural language understanding based, or is it using knowledge graphs? And
yeah, so it's like a lot of it is NLP, natural language processing, and understanding that side of it, and then mixing a few other things, looking like semantic distance and seeing like how frequently words and topics are mentioned near each other or further away. And so that we graph some of that. Like we do have the backend helps us visualize and graph like distances and things like that. So we can see and get a sense of where and when things were talked about in relationship to each other.
So I can see how business would be interested in that, right? There's obviously, right, there's always sort of a quantification type bias, and to some degree, even just, visualizing anything helps kind of move us in the direction of the world that business likes. Mm-hmm. So I can certainly see, the value of that, but then you still have to do the analysis and you still have to sell, the insights, which brings us back to storytelling, and not everybody does well. And so that's always one of those things that just keeps coming up, and on the podcast always, that it's like, everybody, maybe I shouldn't say that everybody is shocked by it, but everybody seems to mention that they spend a lot of their time consistently reminding, coworkers of the insights, and having to always kind of really work hard to get in front of them and get some time to share. Yeah. And that becomes a big part of the job, really, right? That to the point where research is often a smaller portion of the job. Mm-hmm. And, but still, you could spend your time doing that and not necessarily do it well, right? You can make time for it to happen, but communicating it is the second part to that, which takes skill. And so have you learned anything, between TAL, missing link, the role now that you're finding has been particularly helpful for you to communicate the value of, what you're doing as an anthropologist?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the main things is as best you can even what I mentioned before, is know your audience in terms of what are they looking for, and as best you can know, like, where are they coming from. And so, even if you have the same story to tell three different people, you might tell that same story three different ways, right? Depending on where they're coming from. And so, I'd certainly find, like, in a market research context, a lot of our clients are research firms in another company, right? Or they're the research branch of a CPG, a consumer packaged goods company, for example. And so they may have some background in research, but oftentimes it's not anthropology. It's behavioral sciences or economics even, right? Or what we'd say the more distant social sciences, and that's fine. So part of it too is just getting a sense of, when possible, where they're coming from, what their needs are, and then thinking about, if we still do a lot of work internally with our teams to go from the research to the insights to then distilling them to something that we can say quickly. And you probably find this too, even if you, given a presentation to a client and you have, 4 bullet points on a slide, they're like, this is too long. And you're like, I don't know how to make this shorter. Besides, here's just a picture of a duck, and so there's always this challenge too. So it's like, how can I say what needs to be said? And so, honestly, like, both knowing your audience when you can, and like, I know that's a challenge, because if you see a client every once in a while, that's a bit trickier of a thing. But then think through your patterns. Like, what do you see your clients saying over time? And like, they're different people. Like, what is the kind of clientness that is part of how they ask you your questions? And so for me, for example, like, a lot of this work is doing, like, how do we promote a cultural mindset? How do we think about culture as a thing that is fundamental to behavior? And so we want to understand behavior, but behavior only makes sense because culture says it makes sense, right? And so, for example, I think about that because that's often one of the things we talk about all the time. And so if I'm always hitting this problem, then how do I say this? And so even today, actually, I was thinking about this in terms of, it's like we say culture changes quickly. Behavior changes quickly, but culture changes slowly. And so how do we think about that in time scale? So if I want to know what's the drivers of behavior, why they're doing that, that's fine. Let me give you the culture, and then it's going to make sense of why that behavior would even change in the first place or not. And so a lot of it is kind of going through this and just thinking about, what am I trying to share and where are they coming from? Coming from behavior, we want to get culture across. How do we think about that for a question of time scale, which has to do with the way we collect our data, or other kinds of other pieces like that. So I don't know. It's always a learning process, and you are right that it's both a skill and one that, hey, I would love to see schools teach, but then also businesses, kind of teach too, in terms of, like, this is how we can tell stories better. But I don't know. But it is an ongoing challenge.
Mm-hmm. Another challenge must be, you said you're doing sprints, and you said 5-day sprints. So, yep. That's a tight time box, and presumably you are scraping a fair amount of data that then you're going through as a human, which, is labor intensive. And though the tools can probably, help make that a little easier, right? There's still an effort there.
Yeah.
So, without getting into anything too specific about the organization, what are you sort of doing to kind of really keep up with that pace, right? Because that's tough. Anybody listening from academia is going to be horrified right now.
Right. Yes.
Talking big data, and we're talking 5 days. Yes. Right. Which means 2 days, or a day to do analysis.
Yes. I know, right? And using AI to collect data too. Yes, it's a great point. Yeah. There is, the cadence is definitely, it's fast, right? And, for us, part of it is that we work in teams and groups. We're a small organization. We're about 25 people. And so that makes the pace even crazier sometimes. And so there's a few of us that we work primarily on the client success side of things. And so the way that we do this is part of it is to do 5 days, we can break it up with each other. So it's we'll brief in a project with a client. I'll go back and forth with the client to kind of get the framework set up in a way that works. Then I hop with the research team, and then we go over the project. And then they take that part and run with it. I know how that works because I used to do that. And I think researchers are some of the hardest working people in the world, in terms of how do we take the data and crunch it so quickly. And so I'm consistently impressed with how we're able to do that. And kind of the way that works internally too is that we just there's a bit of kind of a bounce back and forth. We have we kind of set a cadence of brief together, researcher runs off, then meet together, go over the ideas. And so we have a set sort of check-in system, if that makes sense. And that's basically, I think, how it keeps going, because it adds cadence to a chaotic 5 days. But then it ultimately works, I think, just because we have batons in place to pass off, if that makes sense, But it's just one of those, even when I first started the job, Ujwal, our CEO, he was like, all right, man, we're excited to work with you, but this is a bit of a sink or swim thing. Like, cause it's like academia is like 2 years. No, man, here's 5 days. And it's a shock to the system to do that. But it works, it works. You just got to be ready to like hit the pedal to the metal, as it were, and and just keep going.
Yeah. And as I've always said, whether, I don't know if on the podcast or at least privately when talking with people, that, I feel that, as long as we're making improvements and we can go back for another sort of iteration and continue making improvements, right? We're not trying to solve everything necessarily in the first pass. Yeah.
100%. 100%.
Yes. And business is, cool with that, right? I mean, so it's, even though the cadence is, it's a fast pace, but it fits within the context ultimately.
Yeah.
The way you often work together.
Yeah. And I think that's a valuable point, that iteration is a much bigger word in business than we see in academia, right? I mean, you iterate all the time in academia, but faster sprints work because you're able to iterate quickly also, right? And you're right. It's like not one and done. It's like, we're going to do this sprint, then we're going to double click into something else after that. And we're going to build our knowledge until we have what we need, or refine our process. Because that was either too fast or didn't work or whatever it is. And so, speed is not the enemy. If we, message to academia, like speed is not your enemy, but it means you have to then be cool with iteration, which I think is a blessing, for lack of a better word. And then to your other point that you just said there, that if we can learn to work in teams more, we can accomplish way more in a faster amount of time.
Yeah. And so that brings up something that you said you were first in the research job, and now you've sort of moved into this other role. And so it sounds like you're touching on a few things now. You're around the research, though maybe not doing it all. And it seems like you're leading some people, interacting with clients. So that brings in some other skills that anthropologists can contribute to the process, right? There's some organizational things in there, right? And so there's a bit more that you get to bring than being just a researcher when you're in a role, a position of influence such as that.
Yeah.
So anything you've learned from that experience that you think is worth sharing?
No, I mean, that's a good point too. I mean, it's the way I kind of think about that is, when we think about anthropology in business or where we might go, like one part of it could be you're an anthropologist working in business. And so you bring perhaps some anthropological skill sets to bear in terms of like managing people or how you might frame a problem. And another side that's interesting is like, if you are, if your work is to do anthropology in business, and we don't have to make too much of a distinction there, but like those can be different in terms of like, if I don't know, if I'm working in, I don't know, the oil field and I'm doing management, then I'm an anthropologist. That's one thing. And I can use anthropological thinking to frame meetings, or if I'm an anthropologist delivering anthropological research or mindsets to clients. And so, I mean, part of it is this in terms of like, how can we think more holistically about our roles? Like both, bringing the, either ourselves in terms of like, what is our training for the kind of work that we're doing? But then I think, I don't know, I guess for me, it's just a question too of like, which I didn't realize before when I was like looking to get into business, understanding like this kind of difference, right? Do I want to be an anthropologist at my job, for lack of a better term? Or do I want to be able to bring my anthropological skill set to work? And they're just like different roles will ask for that differently. And so, that, depending on the kind of work that somebody does, I think. So, it's like anthropology in other things, or anthropology is the work itself, I guess. And so, I didn't know that anthropology could be the work, I guess, if that's a way to say that. And so, I don't think either is better, but like, I didn't know that distinction existed before I was looking into the business world, if that makes sense. And so, I don't know if that's something, I guess it's something I've learned. I don't know what to do with that, but just like, it's been helpful to realize that there is a difference in that. I'm happier doing anthropology work, but, I think they both work. It's just like recognizing that exists and that we have choice.
Yeah, no, it's certainly a good point. And, one of the things I think it brings up is that there's actually a lot of jobs for us, that are not necessarily just researchers. They could be research roles, but there's all kinds of places that we can contribute value and help influence society through business, which, let's face it, business, if you were to think of it as, business has essentially replaced religion, right? As sort of like the major mover of society and all. And so it is of importance that we are there and contributing, I've also had some people say, question me about why would I be working in that space? And I tell them what if we're not there? What are these product services going to turn out like? And so, it's of value that we're there and contributing. And so you're trying to contribute in other ways, and obviously you're going to keep TAL going, but you also are going to be speaking at South by Southwest, which, let you say a little bit about in just a second. But, other things, you'll be at AAA, you're running, a session at Society for Applied Anthropology. And so in all these sort of endeavors, feel free to talk about any of them, but what is it that you're now sort of trying to communicate about business, and what do you want kind of everybody to hear?
Yeah, no, that's a good broad thinking there. So, I don't know. I guess the way I think about a lot of this now is that I've become a little bit more obsessed with taking anthropology mainstream. And so to your point about what's the mass mover, business is one of the mass movers in that regard, in terms of how do we help get the word out in larger ways. And so, yeah, for example, speaking at South by Southwest, I'm super excited for it, following in your footsteps, and just this idea in terms of
what are following from Gigi's footsteps.
From Gigi's footsteps, yes, right. Yeah. All praise Gigi, and so, but so part of it is this in terms of what are, for me, again, I love public speaking and I love kind of engaging audiences. And so part of it is how do we find larger venues or venues where we can get the word about anthropology out. And South by Southwest is particularly amenable to business anthropology or business thinking for anthropology. And so it's, to your point, I think one of the places in which we can have an anthropological impact on business. We're speaking at the advertising and branding track of the different tracks that are part of the program. And our panel, the title is probably going to change, but the current title is Business Anthropology and the Meaning Economy. And speaking about how can anthropology get us to a more fundamental level of, what do things mean to people, get us beyond shiny object syndrome and obsession with, again, behavior and trends. And let's get to the underlying things of what do things mean to people. And that's where we're going to get to, delving to the heart of change, I think. And so part of it too is how can we help business think more deeply and more profoundly, but also how can we as anthropologists find better public stages in which to do this. And so while I'll continue and always will, do work with the AAA and SFAA and EPIC as I can, I think it's important. So, both you too. I'm both proud and excited that you have done, TED Talks and South by Southwest also, because it's these are the places that we need to be also, because anthropologists are not there as much. And so it's important to put ourselves out of our comfort zone. And maybe that's what podcasting was for me back in the day. It was not a thing where anthropologists were. We have to go there. And so, so part of it, I think, is this in terms of how do we help be in those areas. And so, just as a really quick aside, that when I would present about podcasting and doing ethnographic podcasting work at anthropology conferences, I'd always got a meh response from people. And that it, sort of might have hurt the ego, but I got over that very quickly. I was like, okay, I don't really care. At the end of the day, it's a conference presentation if you don't like it. But it was interesting to me why there wasn't more interest in media or podcasting. But when I would go speak about anthropology at a podcasting conference, the room blew up. And I was like, wait a minute, there's something that it's not missing here, but if we only always speak to ourselves, we don't realize actually where the impact could actually be. And so South by and TED Talks and speaking at non-anthropology conferences about anthropology is where the impact can be most profound. So this is why I said at the beginning I'm a crappy professor, because I don't do well in a class. I do good in classrooms, but I'm not good only there. It's like everything. Where else can we be anthropologists? And where is that impact going to have the most kind of ROI? Sorry to use a business term, but where can we have that impact? And so I think part of it is that's exciting to me. So South by, super excited for it. AAA, SFA, and always keep doing TAL too. So there's just so much to do. I'm like a kid in a candy store, It's like
I've always been,
yeah.
So, well, I think that's a great point. I like the way you framed it, that, those other areas that are very open to anthropology is a good place that we need to be. And it's, I think, a good way to think about it. So congrats on South by Southwest. Good luck there. I'm sure you guys will all do wonderful. Gigi Taylor is also hosting a get together.
Yeah.
Hopefully we may see you there for a business pitch that we've put in.
Cool.
We'll see how that goes. Maybe we'll be there otherwise anyway. But thanks for your leadership with TAL and sort of helping to kind of bring many of us forward into sort of this media space. And it was good to talk to you again, as always.
Oh, man, it's a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Anthropology in Business podcast. To learn everything you need to break into business anthropology and why business anthropology is one of the best lenses for contributing to business success, visit my website at mattartz.me, where I cover many topics related to business anthropology and beyond. There you will find all the podcast episodes, blogs, and news. Please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.